Special Agent Jaime Zapata and I were ambushed by Los Zetas cartel.
Was your commitment to not just protecting the lives of people in the United States, but protecting the lives of migrants who frequently are exploited? Welcome to the No Border, No Country podcast. I have with me today a very special guest, Victor Avila, who was an HSI agent and a longtime employee of the Department of Homeland Security with an extended career in law enforcement. He's also the author of this fantastic book, Agent Under Fire, which details his experiences working as an HSI agent on detail in Mexico. We're going to talk about that during the interview. I also want to say that Victor is a true American hero, and it's an honor and a pleasure to have him here. Welcome, Victor.
I appreciate that, man. Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you on. So, for our viewers who may not be familiar with how things work with the Department of Homeland Security, tell them what it is that HSI does and how you wound up in Mexico.
Believe it or not, how good of a question that is, because even after... I think it's over. It was created in 2003, Department of Homeland Security was, and the merger between U.S. Customs Service and Immigration Naturalization Service. There's still been a lot of confusion. Who is HSI? Well, that merger of Immigration and Customs Enforcement always included two divisions: the criminal investigators, or the special agents, what I was, and the deportation officers, or ICE officers. Well, initially when they created ICE, it was ICE officers and ICE special agents, and no one knew who was who. And they have very, very distinct duties, different actually, jurisdictions and all that. And because of the political atmosphere and the reputation that unfortunately that ICE and the media portrayed them, it affected the special agents in doing their job. And the special agents under ICE, even under the name ICE special agent, it wasn't just immigration. People forget that as immigration and customs. But you never hear the customs part. So we did a lot of customs work, everything that has a nexus to our border. This department has a jurisdiction to investigate. And I'm not just talking about drug trafficking, people and goods, right? Illicit movement of people and goods, counterfeit goods, intellectual property rights.
Anti-proliferation of arms.
Anti-proliferation, absolutely. We're talking about devices and possible units of things that could go to Iran to help them build a bomb, stuff like that. So a lot of counterterrorism type of activity as well. But moving forward, the agency recognized that there was an identity crisis here. So in 2010, they called the special agents HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, special agents. And so same job. I have three different badges to show for it. But basically, it's one of those agencies that really bring a broad spectrum of different jurisdictions to investigate violations of law.
Fantastic. Now, I was an assistant chief counsel with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, so I had the honor and the pleasure of giving legal advice to both the HSI agents and to the deportation officers. And I was shocked when I was working there to find out just how broad the jurisdiction is for the special agents. The deport officers have an incredibly tough and dangerous job to do, but their primary focus is on enforcing the civil and certain criminal provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act and finding people who are not supposed to be here and removing them from the U.S. But the HSI agents do everything from criminal investigations into drug trafficking and human trafficking to serving as Homeland Security attaches in other countries, which is what you were assigned to do.
That's what I did. My career took me to Mexico first, right over the other side of the border in El Paso, Texas, where I'm born and raised. And I was very fortunate as agents to go back to my hometown. It was very advantageous to me. I was a federal probation officer before that, so I was very aware of the court system, the one that starts that other part of the justice system that starts when you slap cuffs on someone. So I was very familiar with that, and then I had an opportunity to serve in Ciudad Juarez in the U.S. consulate on the other side. This was 2008, when that city was the most dangerous city in the world, experiencing about 350 homicides a month. So think about that. It was just violence around that city and overwhelming with work. And we had 2 agents at that time working there. So I went to supplement them in a temporary duty that led to my permanent assignment to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City as an ICE representative.
Now, for the viewers, when you talk about Ciudad Juarez and 350 homicides a month, that city sits right on the border of the United States.
It's right there. I mean, I grew up there. I grew up going over there. I know both cities very well. And El Paso has changed. And I could talk a little bit about what's happening in the last year and a half, 2 years under this administration. But El Paso, ironically, for being a big city over, I think it's close to 1 million people now, one of the safest cities in the country. It's going away. And it's unfortunate because of what's happening now. But it's this thing that was this phenomenon that he couldn't explain, that the violence, even the cartel lives in Mexico and in El Paso, and they come over, but they will leave their guns, they will leave their illicit activities. Yes, you have those cases of people getting kidnapped and taken to Mexico, sure. But for the most part, it stayed on the Mexican side. However, the threat was always there. That has definitely changed in the last few years because the cartels have become very brazen. They, not just El Paso, McAllen, but along the whole Texas border, Arizona, they are in the United States. They're not just in our border cities and border states, but everywhere in our country.
So that brings me to an interesting thing. We had Mark Morgan, the former chief of the Border Patrol and commissioner of CBP, on recently as a guest. And I said to him, when most people think about the cartels, they tend to think Miami Vice. They think Medellin cartel, the 1980s, the drugs. But that's not true anymore. The cartels have expanded. So could you talk a little bit about that?
I just came back from doing a presentation to the Alabama Sheriff's Association and broke down that involvement, the evolution of the cartels. I want people to understand that these are highly sophisticated criminal networks. They're not drug gangs. I don't even call them drug cartels anymore. For many years, we call them DTOs, drug trafficking organizations. They're beyond that. They're terrorists in my eyes. I write about it in the book, about the designation, designating them as FTOs, or foreign terrorist organizations. But they are not only in drug trafficking, of course, they're still involved in that, but they've taken over the human trafficking, the human smuggling, the lime trade, the avocado trade. I just did a story the other day, this week, about them getting involved in taking over the jellyfish trade out of Mexico. They, the oil trade as well. There's a word in Spanish that I like saying it. It's hard to pronounce. Huachicoleros. Have you ever heard that? These are the guys that steal the petroleum in Mexico. Well, there's millions of dollars to be made there. And they're a criminal enterprise. They're headquartered in Mexico, but they work here in D.C., in Texas, in Arizona, in Alabama, where I was. They're everywhere, and 40 countries abroad.
One of the things that I think about when I think about this is, back when we were all in school, we learned about the triangle trade with slavery, where there was trade for sugar, rum, and slaves in this endless circle. And right down to the slavery, I think that the cartels are very much like that. So you mentioned the jellyfish, and I think a lot of our viewers probably don't know. The reason that it's jellyfish is because there's a crazy appetite in Asia for exotic seafood. The Chinese are producing massive quantities of fentanyl, which is very dangerous. There's been, I think, over 100,000 deaths this year alone from fentanyl overdoses. So the way this works is that the cartels buy the fentanyl, they pay for it in exotic seafood to get it from the Chinese. Then they bring the fentanyl over the border to the United States. They change it into cash, and they use the cash to support their operations for human trafficking, which includes unlawful labor, unlawful child labor, sex trafficking, and they're also involved in trafficking guns. And there has been some indication in the intelligence recently that they're involved in moving members of terrorist organizations over the border into the United States.
We heard, and DA had a big case years ago, Hezbollah. They work with Hezbollah and these terrorist organizations. And that's another part about the cartels that a lot of times people don't talk about, is the national security aspect of it. And yes, what do? They want power and money. They produce money. What do the terrorist organizations want? Money to finance their operations. And so they have linked up with the cartels to get some of that money to finance their illicit activities. And guess what? Because the border's so open, the cartel not only controls the border of Mexico, they control Mexico. They're running a parallel government down there for sure, and they have influence in not just the police systems but the political systems, the media. 11 journalists were killed last year in Mexico. That's the unofficial number. 11 or 15, I forget. Sorry, but I think unofficially it was 30. It's the most dangerous country for a journalist to work in. Not the Middle East, not Syria, and so. It's all because of the cartels. But I want to add real quick about China. You mentioned the jellyfish. Yeah, it might be a payment right there. It might be they're getting a deal because the precursors continue to come in. And the government of Mexico is so corrupt. I never hear the seizure of the precursors down in the port of Veracruz. We stopped them. Or I never hear about the big takedown of the arms trafficking, even though some of those, we know the arms come from the U.S. Well, Mexico has a customs, and they have an immigration, and they have a border, and they keep on telling us, especially through the president, of their sovereignty and how they're not going to allow anybody to violate that. Well, it kind of like, well, why don't you stop it then? Why don't you do something about it? And so Mexico has a big role to play here.
Yeah, Mexico, I think, is teetering on the verge of becoming a failed state. It's sad to say that it may actually be the criminal interests that are keeping it together as a nation to this point.
That's right.
So that brings me to the other point. You had mentioned before that the situation is getting much worse in El Paso and indeed all along the border. Put it in a nutshell, why is that?
And it's so, the timing of this podcast interview is so good on that question because there was a report that came out, I think it was, I don't know if it was the Washington Time, I forget the source, but it just came out this week where they said that the border is eerily quiet after Title 42 went away in May, that nothing's going on down there. And I'm over here, how in the world can you dare say that? Because I'm there all the time. I see it, and the illegal immigration hasn't stopped. Now, the way they're coming has changed. This week, on Monday, this past Monday, this administration is now allowing Central Americans and Colombians to fly in from their country into the United States. And they put some caveats. You have to have a U.S. citizen, family member, and all I hear is fraud. When I see these things, I just hear smell fraud, think fraud, and it's circumventing our legal immigration system. And they're inventing these policies. They're creating these policies because of the mass migration and they're blatantly doing and want to do it. There's a lot of issues there, but it's not just the illegal immigration part. I tell people it's a bigger picture. Yes, China, Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, Iran. My goodness, this is a national security issue. The fentanyl is killing us. We don't seem to care about it. No one here is doing. I haven't heard the public servants announcements. I haven't seen the billboard or the social media outreach to have our kids. I say it to I have an 18-year-old son and 23-year-old daughter. Don't you dare take a pill, because 6 out of 10 pills in this country is counterfeit, laced with fentanyl or xylazine.
Right, you have no idea what's in them. These aren't being made in a laboratory by Eli Lilly or Novo Nordisk.
No, you and I will take one. I'll die because, of course, that one has more than the one you had. They don't care. One of the questions I get a lot is why would the cartel kill the people that are taking their drugs? And I tell them they don't care. They're making the money, and there's plenty of people to come around and plenty of customers per se. So a lot of challenges like, why don't you take care of the drug addiction issue? Yes, I know that the U.S. is the number one consumer, but I choose to take the cartels and eliminate the supply. We have to. There is no control of supply right now. It's full-fledged coming through the border, and it is coming through the ports of entry and in between the ports of entry.
So is it safe to say that the Biden administration appears to be deliberately circumventing the legal way to come into the United States? You said they're undermining our laws. The law requires you to have a visa if you're going to enter the United States, unless you are either seeking asylum and have a legitimate claim, or if you are a participant in any of the visa waiver programs, which usually involves countries like France and Belgium that are stable and have a good relationship with the United States. So it's not within the purview of the Biden administration, is it, to say, oh, you don't need a visa anymore?
No, absolutely not. It's complete lawlessness and completely against not just our immigration laws, but our own constitution. This policy that went into effect this week with Central America and Colombia is going to give them work permits, and some are going to be brought in with paroles. You cannot substitute a parole permit. As an agent, I had the authority to issue paroles. You cannot circumvent and issue a parole permit because of you're an asylum seeker. It doesn't work that way. You can't blend those two systems together, but that's what they're doing. And I mean, it's gotten to the point where I think that whatever millions of people have come in the last 2.5 years, they're all here on a false premise. They actually entered illegally, whether they do the CBP-1 app or whether they brought in through a port of entry with the paperwork that the Border Patrol gave them, or this administration gave them. They're still here illegally, because if you do kind of, back in towards my, I'm remembering my investigations, and if the fruit of the poisonous tree, right? If I do something wrong initially, fundamentally on a search warrant or an arrest warrant, then everything else is going to get kicked out. That's how I feel it's going to happen here. These people are here thinking, oh, I'm going to be okay, and I have a permit, it's a false given permit, a false premise, and it's going to be a big issue here come next year.
Well, it's going to be a huge issue, and I think the point you raise about parole is a significant one. The Obama administration and the Biden administration seem to think that parole is a magic wand that allows them to bypass the Immigration and Nationality Act and admit whoever they want. I started my career in immigration as an immigration examiner back in the day. And of course, they had us doing secondary inspections and things like that at the district offices. So I was occasionally involved in issuance of parole as well. And what they beat into our heads from day one was that this is not a catch-all. It's Section 212D5 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And there's 3 categories. There's the law enforcement specific one. There's special interest parole, which usually has to do with intelligence cooperators under Public Law 110, Section 7. And then you have what is called the significant public benefit parole. And I was actually just discussing this with one of the guys over at FAIR yesterday. That was designed in the Cold War for Soviet defectors. It wasn't designed to admit mass numbers of people seeking asylum, and it's supposed to be used on a case-by-case basis.
Right. And believe me, we took it very seriously as an agent. Sometimes for those 2 reasons, that's the ones that we use the most. The public benefit parole or the law enforcement one is the one I use the most. But it was specifically for that. And it had a lot of checks and balances. We couldn't just issue them out to anybody because you want to come into the country. No. It had nothing to do with asylum.
And there was no blanket.
There's no blanket. Asylum is a complete different set of criteria that you would immediately, when you sought asylum at the port of entry, you would immediately be taken to a different route. Mm-hmm. I mean, really completely different. It's a different process. But when you do that, and all of a sudden it's millions of people, you start making mistakes. You start allowing terrorists in without even though you encountered them, even though you interdicted them, and you saw that. You saw this just last week, where one of the person on the terror watch list was released, and eventually caught a couple of weeks later by ICE. And there was a lot of miscommunication, the one agency to the other, even within DHS. But why does that happen? It happens because this administration has put a lot of pressure on the men and women of Border Patrol, ICE, and others to get them in. Get them in no matter what. It's impossible to vet a person. I've vetted people. I've vetted corporations. I've vetted. It takes a long time. You can't just do it in 5 minutes out of one database computer check. And I talk to Border Patrol agents all the time that tell me, I have this subject in front of me that even though he might be clear on his fingerprints of criminal history, he has a suspect of more questions and phone calls, maybe call some consulates from the original country. But he can't because he doesn't have the time. There's 1,000 people that he has to process.
Well, and the other thing is you can't vet people that come from countries where there's no records. So
that's right.
I think what people don't realize about vetting is there's no mystical, magical computer database that has nationwide, international, worldwide information in it. And so if you're talking about somebody from Yemen where their birth certificate may have been entered 6 years after their birth when their father happened to walk to the equivalent of the county seat to, buy seed for the farm or something. it's impossible to vet those people. They don't leave the kind of paper and identity trail that people in the Western world leave.
And if they do happen to have them, they're throwing them away and getting rid of them right before they get to the port or the bridge or in between the Rio Grande River or Arizona, because they don't want to be identified. They want to be able to give Border Patrol whatever name they want to give it. And as you said, there's no check on it. We have to take their word for it. And that's what we're doing. And so if we have encountered, I think, over 200 now under this administration that we have detected on the terror watch list, no-fly list, how many have they actually entered this country without any vetting that we know is a different ideology? You know, I get a little pushback because I want to designate the cartels as FTOs. I understand the controversy with that and the challenges. One of them is that, well, they're not like ISIS. They're not like these other terrorist organizations. And my pushback is, if the ideology might be different, their ideology is power and money, but they're still killing us. Death is death. And so I don't remember the last time ISIS killed 200,000 Americans. And so they're getting away with it through the help of China and they're loving it. And so now we are allowing people that do want to harm us because of our Western culture and religious beliefs. And now it's a big issue. Why do we have to wait? I don't want to see another attack in this country for us to wake up. I'm trying to have people wake up now.
And there's an interesting overlap, too, between the terrorist groups. So Hezbollah is associated with Lebanon, but it's an Iranian proxy. And so we have to worry about the terrorists, but we also have to worry about the people who are professionally trained and employed in the intelligence services of these foreign countries. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is the other group of people coming over the border are guys who got training like you and I did from their government, but their training was focused on how to evade the immigration authorities, how to come into the United States, and how to stay so that they can try and get information that foreign countries want to use to harm us.
Two major groups, Venezuelans and Chinese nationals. And let me tell you, I talked to a lot of Venezuelans here in this country, legal Venezuelans that tell me, Victor, please, that's not us. That's not our people. They know, and they tell me there's a lot of infiltration of Venezuelan nationals, soldiers, intelligence community that we have absolutely no checks on. They came in because they're clean, but they're claiming, you know, I'm just here, an economic migrant, and I'm getting away from Venezuela, and I want to come here to work. Well, we don't know about all of them. And that's the scary part. And of course, China's coming at us from every direction. Now they're actually sending the people. Are these people forced labor people? Are they going to be placed on these, because I worked these Chinese smuggling cases. I worked a big one out of China, Mexico, and New York. Took down this great organization, a big organization of Chinese smuggling for forced labor. They had them in sweatshops. Are they going to do that? Or are they going to have infiltrators in our universities? Scientists and the such. So these are the real questions that we should be asking.
Well, and I think the answer to at least with the Chinese is it's all of the above. There's been a 400, some people say a 600 to 800% increase since Joe Biden took office in the number of Chinese nationals coming over the border. And I think that's a result of the fact that, as one federal judge put it in a case decision, it's as if the federal government has hung a big neon sign on the border claiming that we are open for business.
Yep. That's where we're at right now. And it hasn't slowed down. Texas put a bunch of buoys on the river this week. I have opinions about that. We haven't addressed the illegal immigration correctly. We haven't dealt with the cartels correctly. We haven't dealt with Mexico correctly. And all the other governments that are there, a lot of the times we're fighting ourselves with these policies. A lot of times we're fighting within the communities on the border. And so it's a big challenge, but you can't deny that we all want national security and public safety for our citizens. I think we could all agree that I want to be safe in my own house, in my own town.
Definitely.
I'm Tom Homan. The Biden administration is reversing America's progress on immigration, reversing ICE's ability to deport criminal illegal aliens, reversing job protections for Americans, and construction of the wall. That's why I've joined Early, the Immigration Reform Law Institute. Early uses the courts to stop bad immigration policies. Join me. Support Early at early.org. Help win the immigration fight in the courtroom. Paid for by the Immigration Reform Law Institute.
So This brings me, and I know this is a difficult subject, but I heard you talk very movingly when we were in Israel about your experience down in Mexico. And could you summarize that for our viewers?
Absolutely. On February 15, 2011, Special Agent Jaime Zapata and I were ambushed by Los Zetas cartel as we were driving back from picking up some equipment that they had sent us on a trip and an assignment that I challenged. There's a lot of questions about it. I go into detail about it in the book. But 12 of them, we don't know the total number. 8 was the official number of shooters, ambushed us, forced us off the road, shot at us over 100 rounds. Agent Zapata paid the ultimate sacrifice in defending our country with his life. I'm here by the grace of God after being shot 3 times by them. And so it changes you. My wife will be the first one to tell you that it made me a different person, and in her words, a better person, because when you go through an event like that, and for me, it was kind of a very unique situation. I'm a Hispanic. My culture is from Mexico, but I'm not a Mexican national. I'm an American, and so I felt the patriotism at that time when I was alone in that Suburban, waiting for the backup. And especially when we got sent over to the hospital and I feared for my life. That's when I really feared for my life. But I was a proud American. I remember being proud the first time I told the hospital crew and the doctors and the nurses who I was, because I had kept it. I haven't told them exactly who I was because I didn't want them. I didn't want them to know because I thought they were going to kill me. And so I had refused an IV. I had refused medication. And it was a very dark days that we went through. So it really, after I took a medical retirement in 2015, my passion to defend the homeland hasn't gone away. My passion to defend the state of Texas and the United States is still there. So I'm going to continue to do that. I want to continue to do that, to be able to make an impact. But to me, it's personal. I mean, to me, I know exactly the imminent threat that we face from the cartels. They're not afraid of law enforcement anymore. Not in Mexico, not of U.S. law enforcement. There was this underlying rule. They're not going to mess with federal law enforcement after the death of Agent Camarena in 1985. And that's all. All those rules don't exist anymore. The cartels have no rules. They will decapitate you. They will put you in a 50-barrel gallon and dissolve you in acid. And this is the reality that we live in. But the reality is they have infiltrated our country. They're here.
So I think I grew up in a family full of police officers, and when I was listening in Israel to you telling your story, I was actually fighting back tears because I know what it's like to sit and wait for the call from the hospital when somebody has been injured that you love and care about and that you want to know is okay. And they were out just doing their job trying to protect the public, and yet they have become the victim of somebody with evil intent. But you mentioned Agent Camarena. That was Enrique Camarena, who was a DEA agent. His nickname was Kiki. And he was kidnapped, I forget by which cartel, and then they hired a doctor to torture him in order to keep him alive to try and extract information from him. And he was recovered when some former law enforcement agents from the United States, who are now working as private investigators, essentially kidnapped his tormentors and brought them back into the United States under a legal doctrine called the Kerr-Frisbee doctrine, which says that if you have committed a crime, how you came into the jurisdiction in order to face trial is irrelevant. You may have a civil case against somebody who kidnapped you. There may even be a criminal case, but it doesn't affect your legal culpability. So I think that was a significant case. It happened during the Reagan era, and it scared the cartels, which is why they adopted those rules that they weren't going to mess with federal law enforcement.
Well, this is part of the evolution of the cartels that many other law enforcement agents in Mexico have been held at gunpoint at one point or other by cartels. They identify themselves, and then the cartels, steps back and said, okay, they don't want to mess with you. That changed in 2011 with our case. But bringing up a little bit of a legal background, I was just here in D.C. testifying on 2 of the defendants to get resentenced because they were convicted in 2017 of murder, attempted murder of an internationally protected person, and weapons charges. Well, 2 the ones that went to trial, 2 of these defendants, these evildoers, appealed their sentence, saying that the murder statute wasn't it wasn't valid because a murder happened extraterritorially, meaning outside of the United States. And the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with them, vacated the murder charge. They dismissed it. It was horrible news to receive that. I'm the one that communicated that information to the Zapata family. And this is 2019. I'm thinking, what in the world is going on? And so I fought back. I got in touch with our legislators, and we changed the law. It took 2 years. Nancy Pelosi blocked it a couple of times from hitting the floor, but we had bipartisan support, and we passed the Jaime Zapata and Victor Avila Federal Officer and Employee Protection Act for the same reasons, to protect the men and women that continue to serve, to seek justice in case something like this happens. And we added assault to a family member as well. But so nevertheless, it wasn't retroactive to our case. They had to bring back the defendants and resentence them. Luckily, they resentenced them back to life plus 20 years.
And if you stop and think about that decision by the D.C. Circuit, it's absurd, because there's been extraterritorial murder of U.S. official statutes on the books since the founding of the Republic.
A lot of precedents there.
It's crazy. Right. So you had mentioned that the cartel that targeted you and your partner, Agent Zapata, were the Zetas. For our viewers, the Zetas, as I understand it, were a cartel that was composed of former Mexican Army Special Forces members who were trained by the Green Berets. The Mexican Army wasn't paying them regularly enough or enough money, and as a result, they went rogue, licensed themselves out to the cartels as hitmen and special operations people. Then they figured they could just take it over, develop their own cartel, and they're now running their own special forces style training to train people. So they've skipped the whole military step, and they're directly recruiting Mexican youth into this and training them in techniques and tactics that the Mexican military and law enforcement use.
Very well said, man. And originally, the original Zeta members came from Guatemala and then infiltrated them into Mexico. And yes, they became the enforcers for the Gulf Cartel. That's initially who they were. And when they factioned off, became their own cartel, they made a name for themselves because of the level of violence. They brought that violence that we hadn't seen before in the cartels. I've been working on the cartels for many, many years, and you would have a shootout here, a shootout there. But what they brought was this barbaric, medieval, decapitation, and it's horrible to describe, but I have to say it so people get an idea. Peeling someone's skin off their face and putting it over another, cutting someone's heart while they're out of their chest while they're still alive and holding it in their hand. There's all these videos out there. I don't want to see the videos anymore. I've seen already so many in my career. I still get them, by the way. I get them almost on a daily basis. They're still doing that. They're still active. After our case, they did suffer a major blow. The hierarchy got taken down, the higher-ups. Some were extradited. Some are still in prison in Mexico. And so because of that weakness, they faction off to the CDN, Cartel del Noreste, or Cartel of the Northeast, which right now their territory is the other side of Laredo, Texas. That is where they at, and their major concentration, not just drugs, but human smuggling. That's what they do. These are the people that'll put humans in the back of a tractor trailer. They don't care. They'll transport them, stash them in a house in Laredo. Very little food, very little water. And so, very violent, and they're still there. So the Zetas still exist, but mostly faction off to CDN.
So what I want the viewing public to understand, I know this was that you guys were victims of this, so I don't want to sound like I'm depersonalizing this, but this wasn't an attack on Special Agent Avila and Special Agent Zapata. It was what you guys represented,
correct,
which is the United States.
That's very clear. I'm glad you said that, because I've always said that. It wasn't I'm going to kill Victor and Jaime. It was Americans. They knew we were Americans. They testified that we were Americans. I'd never had a scumbag evildoer ever corroborate my testimony. But since 2011, I was saying, these guys must have heard me. I yelled from the Suburban, we're Americans, we're U.S. diplomats. This is a diplomatic vehicle. We're U.S. Embassy employees. I asked them, I yelled at them if I could identify myself with my black diplomatic passport. So there was always this question, did they hear me? No, yeah, they testified, in fact, that they did hear me. And they even thought that I was a U.S. ambassador. They knew we were Americans. it was not a carjacking. I'll tell you right now that even the U.S. government and the assistant U.S. attorney's office went with that storyline. I don't believe it by a second. They didn't want that Suburban. They destroyed that Suburban. They wanted at that point to kill Americans. They could have, and they had the choice when they heard us to say, "Oh, wrong people, wrong guys." In fact, if that was the case, and leave us alone because we were American agents. No, they didn't.
Well, and I think it's important. The reason why they resent America, and I think it's important for the public to understand that. You guys were a symbol of America, but more importantly, despite the spleen that's been heaped upon the United States since Joe Biden has taken office, and despite the apologies President Obama made for everything, the fact is the world knows that the United States is a potent, capable, powerful nation which has a Judeo-Christian moral compass and which has been a beacon of kindness and hope to the entire world. So what you guys were a symbol of how the United States, if it got its act together, could erase them from the face of the earth and end this kind of crime if the U.S. chose to use guys like you and I.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to put myself in the same category. I was never shot at, but
you're an expert in your own right, and you know this very well. And it doesn't help that it was that two of the weapons recovered are part of Operation Fast and Furious under the Obama-Biden administration. So that doesn't help either. And so you think about the whole picture there. It was impactful. It was an international incident. I think it would have definitely been a very, very different approach and reaction if it would have been a different administration in the U.S. at that point. Although there was a good law enforcement response, I don't think there was a good diplomatic response. There wasn't. They weren't held accountable to what I would want them to be held accountable. And I'm not just talking about the Zetas. I'm talking about the cartels in general, because then you have the creation of the Cartel Jalisco New Generation that have now probably become the second biggest cartel in the world. Sinaloa, they're fighting for that trophy, and Sinaloa, very powerful, still taking over the state of Chihuahua, where I studied a lot and I worked a lot, and I never thought it was the Juarez cartel, very powerful back then. No, it's all now mostly Sinaloa has taken over. This is the threat that I think people don't recognize. Arizona used to be known as Cocaine Alley. Now it's Fentanyl Alley. And although we have seen in the last year an increased seizures, you see all these fentanyl seizures, and I celebrate them as well. But I tell people it's not a good thing. When I was a narcotics agent and we saw the seizures go up, we knew that we were getting our butts kicked. That's not a good thing.
Yeah, because there's a lot of stuff you're missing.
That's right. You're missing. I mean, we're grabbing 10, 15% maybe of what's coming over. And so although the seizures look good, we see so many thousands and hundred thousands of pills here, it's great. It's only an indicator of that much that's actually coming in and making it all the way to our communities, and cocaine all the way to the White House.
No, and there's this ridiculous notion now that most of the drugs comes through legal ports of entry, which is ridiculous. That's a statement made by people who don't understand how the border works at all.
Well, I got backpackers. I mean, I've investigated all of them, right? Port of entry, in between port of entry. It's coming through everywhere. Any opportunity that the cartel has, if you can think of that, of a way to smuggle drugs into this country, the cartel has already thought about it and attempted it. And the hardest part with the pills is that they're so easily concealed. You could conceal it anywhere. It's very different, like a brick of cocaine and marijuana. In vehicles, I've seen it in so many different types of parts of furniture. Pills could be anywhere, and it's very hard to detect.
So one of the things that moved me when I heard you talk, and when I heard Tom Homan talk when we were in Israel, and I know Tom pretty well, and Mark Morgan as well, it was your commitment to not just protecting the lives of people in the United States, but protecting the lives of migrants who frequently are exploited. And I don't think the public understands. One of the things that drives me nuts, when I was an immigration judge, I was called a Nazi. I was called all kinds of things. When I was a trial attorney with ICE, I don't think people understand what a committed group the people that work for Homeland Security are. One time I was in my office working late one evening, and one of the deport officers stopped by and said, "Hey, listen, you got any cash on you?" And I said, "Yeah, what do you need?" He said, "Well, we're taking a group of unaccompanied minors to send them back, and I want to stop at McDonald's and feed them before they get on the airplane because we don't know if the airlines, once they leave the United States, will take care of them properly." And this was a regular thing. People would reach in their pockets and they would hand over money for this. And this was nothing that was ever recovered from the government.
You don't hear those stories enough. I'll give you one. I flew, and I've flown many times. Another pet peeve of mine is illegals getting on an airplane without an identification.
It makes me crazy.
But despite how you feel about immigration, legal immigration, I've flown with children next to me. Mm-hmm. That the person they're with is not their father. It's just adult male who knows who the heck, after I've talked to them and I have asserted that this person is not related to this child. One time it was a 3-year-old little girl. It was a very early flight. That guy was giving her Coca-Cola in a bottle. Well, first of all, she's 3. I'm like, I don't remember my daughter having a bottle at the age of 3. Maybe she was 4. I don't know. But she was at least 3 years old. And he fed her soda. And when we got off the airplane and he was connecting, he didn't know where to go. And I'm there connecting him to the flight. And I gave him money. I said, you go buy her some food right now that's available for her. And I'm going to watch you go in there at that restaurant in the airport. And I want to see you buy her food. He says, okay. And he did and took her. Because we are compassionate people. Because we don't want to see death at the border. We have an incredible amount of death, not just in drownings. This past week, 4 drownings, including a toddler. Yep. Drownings, hangings, self-hangings, suicides by migrants become delirious. Death by the sun. This sun is cooking them to death. And we've had so many this season, which is a very, very hot summer season. Death. Rapes, sexual assaults. And I know Tom and I share this with passion, saying, if the border was secure, we would actually save lives. We would prevent crimes. We would prevent these people becoming victims at the hands of the cartel, and not just the cartel, other corrupt governments, military. Yes. Believe me, I hear the stories directly from the migrants themselves. Sometimes it's not the cartel that they're being violated or assaulted, or the men sexually assaulted or beaten up. It's sometimes the governments themselves, the military members and soldiers and such, especially when they're coming all the way from the Darien Gap. That's another whole problem that's going on over there. And by the way, I want to mention something. I'm planning a trip down there to Panama and to El Salvador. You know, it's changed in Salvador drastically with President Bukele there, and Bukele, I'm sorry, you couldn't pronounce it. And so I want to go talk to them. I want to see what they're doing, what the changes, because there are countries that want to implement change. They are starting to implement the change in their countries, but they're not getting the feedback or the backup from the government. I say it all the time. I want the burden shifted back to these countries. The burden has been placed on us, the United States, for somehow to take care of the rest of the world. It cannot be done, but it has nothing to do with compassion or racism or anything. It has to do with sovereignty. It has to do with laws. It has to do with a lot of other things. But I want to put that burden and shift it back to them and say, I'm willing to help you if you want to help yourself. And those 2 countries that met, Panama and El Salvador, are doing it. Mexico is not. I would love to do something there too.
Well, if you plan that trip, let me know. I would be happy to join you. I want to bring my camera and show the world what's going on down there.
That would be great.
So speaking of trips, we were in Israel together. That's where I met you. Fantastic trip we had.
Incredible.
So we're talking about all the problems that the U.S. has and this being done incorrectly. Israel is doing it correctly. So talk about some of the things that we witnessed in Israel. Well,
aside from going to all the borders, the Syrian border, Lebanese border, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Egyptian border, what I took back, a couple of things. One, it didn't matter who their president was. Border security is border security for them. It's a matter of life and death. They didn't say, well, if so-and-so is from this party and is our president, we're going to ignore all this. We're going to ignore Hamas on this side. We're going to ignore Hezbollah on this side. And we're going to ignore the threat from the West Bank because of the president.
Yeah, it's a nonpartisan issue.
It has nothing. Left, right, so you think about it. But also the second part, what I felt was the seriousness and the attention that they give border security. Obviously, we're lacking that here in the United States because it has become political. It shouldn't. I say this all the time. Illegal immigration, if you really think about it, has nothing to do with border security other than it's immigration. If you dealt with the immigration part of it, you would still have to deal with border security.
Yeah.
Border security continues the national security threat and all this. Immigration is being used to violate that non-border security that it doesn't exist right now, but border security is needed all the time. We're in different times here. After 9/11, our world changed, but we're suffering 3 9/11s a month here with death. But no one seems to respond to that. And so that's what I got from Israel. That was the core messaging. I've seen a lot of the port of entries. I saw, obviously, their wall. Another thing was the technology of their fence was different.
Amazing.
That was amazing. I'll tell you another thing that I brought, and I'd love to see, is towers. Like good old-fashioned tower. You saw them. By the way, both the terrorists have the towers, and Israel has the towers. They're staring at each other 24 hours. That's what I want to do. I want to see towers on the border, but bulletproof glass to protect our agents. But they need to have eyes on that border 24/7, just like we used to do. The mark on the X with the patrol. Of course, I'm talking about actually having our border agents go down and do their job, because that's what they want to do, and putting 80% of them back on the line instead of just processing. I like those towers, and I showed a video that I just got during this presentation yesterday in Alabama, where it's in El Paso, and there's an influx of people coming in, and it's the camera, the Border Patrol agent that's manning the camera. It's a group of 100 illegals coming. He puts it out on the radio, and I play that video, and it's a 1-minute video, because of the demoralization that the border agents have gone through. There's a chuckle in their voices when he puts that out and says, hey, we got a group of 100. The agent that responds chuckles, and he kind of goes, yeah, like, what do you want me to do about it? I am doing hospital watch, he says, and I can't respond. And the camera operator is like, well, 10-4 doing all the codes and and I'm going to count them as 100. 10-4 that. That's it. This is where we're at. That the agent has to be at the hospital. And hospital watch, by the way, is border agents have to be secure or observe or defend or whatever you want to do it, illegal aliens at the hospital. They have to watch them. And a lot of these illegals that come in, the first thing they do is they'll claim some kind of medical ailment, even something as small as a stomach ache or something, straight to the hospital. And when Title 42 went away, a lot of things were changing. They were going to supposedly go under Title 8. I know you're an expert in that. And you know what thing that got me mad was like they started saying that Title 8 was going to kick in. What do you mean kick in?
It never left.
You can't choose what laws you kick in. And I told the sheriffs, imagine if your mayor or the county commissioner told you, we're not going to enforce DUI anymore. That's it. As of this day, we're not going to enforce. You have to identify them. You'll still have to pull them over, but then you're going to let them go.
Oh, you took the words right out of my mouth. This drives me nuts about immigration and the priorities. The NYPD never publishes a list of priorities and tells the criminal defense attorneys, listen, we're not going to prosecute jaywalking and John law violations because we really need to crack down on the shoplifting and the burglaries. It just doesn't happen. The law is the law.
And it's going across the country. In Dallas, they just put out the list. You will not be prosecuted. Nobody's going to come out. As a matter of fact, they put out a list just last week of what the police is going to respond to, what 911 calls. Yep. So if it's not in that category, you just go online and do your report.
Yeah. That started with immigration. Immigration was the first field where they selectively chose what laws they were going to enforce, and it's expanding now, and it's not good for the country. But when you were talking about the camera, it made me think of something. One of the first stops we made along that wall that was put up at the highway to stop the snipers.
Oh, the shooting, yeah.
We were standing there with a guide who was a retired IDF officer. And very small group of people, very obviously a tour bus. And instantly, there was a guy in a tower with a high-powered rifle with a huge scope trained on us. And 2 guys in a white van armed to the teeth from the IDF pulled up to check on us afterwards.
Yes, and I saw that too.
That response was almost, I don't know where those guys were. I didn't hear them coming at a high speed, but they appeared out of nowhere. And the fact is that Israel has its border staffed, and it's using a combination. You know, one of the things that is an argument that's always made is we don't need a border wall because we can use technology. But the problem is, if the nearest agent is 50 miles away, and a sensor or a camera picks up people coming over the border, then you wind up losing them as the agent is getting there.
Right.
In Israel, they had combined the technology and the human element in such a way that it made it virtually impossible for people to violate that border.
And we have that here, but it doesn't matter if you're not going to utilize it. As soon as when Biden came in, and he stopped the construction of the border wall, I went down to Hudspeth County. Hudspeth County is the big county right next to El Paso, Texas, El Paso County. Mostly desert. The river is very dry. I stood in the middle of the Rio Grande River, did a video and showing people how wide open it is. But I went to the wall where it ended, right? Mm-hmm. And I was there at night. And it took maybe about an hour and a half for the BP agent. Yes, we set off the sensors. And here he comes, finally. And he was such a great guy. And it was pitch dark out there. And he's giving me a good briefing, telling me a lot of stuff that's going on. He says, yeah, this is where they stopped the wall. And I said, what about I saw the lights, these huge, incredible, better than stadium lights that light up that whole area, because there, the border is right there. It's the river, the road where Border Patrol, and then the wall, and then a lot of brush. And there's a lot of officer safety issues involved there because they could be literally pointing a gun at you and you can't see them. Anyway, I asked him, what about the lights? Well, they shut down the lights too. And the fiber optic on the ground that we have is shut down too. I go, what does that have to do with building the wall? Everything was shut down. And so you're absolutely right. It's a combination of tools. It's not the wall by itself. It's not the barrier. The fence in Israel was pretty cool because of the technology attached to the fence. That's something that I would love to see in our border. But it is a complete law enforcement approach to that. The real person understands that it's not just the wall, it's the personnel, it's the technology, it's the policy.
Yes.
It's the enforcement of it. You could have all that, and if you still don't enforce it, it doesn't matter. And so it's the follow through, right? It's the follow through. I use the example a lot of growing up, and as a father and myself, the way I was disciplined by my parents, they had the follow through. I didn't do something, and they punished me, and then 2 seconds later they said, no, everything's okay. No, they followed through with the punishment and the grounding and all that. We need to follow through now.
Well, and I think that the other point that you brought up is we're constantly pulling Border Patrol agents, CBP officers, sometimes ICE personnel and USCIS personnel off their duties at the border in order to process these folks, instead of doing the things that they're supposed to be doing at the border. I didn't see that at Israel.
No.
Their crossing point authority people manned the crossing points. The IDF people who were stationed on the border weren't worrying about what was happening elsewhere in Israel. They were focused on the border. And, I think a lot of people don't realize, and I know you know this because you've worked there, but this is for our viewers, Border Patrol agents, most of them, are deputized as local county sheriff's deputies and local police officers. And so one of their jobs is in these big wide open spaces where frequently there is not as much law enforcement presence, is to act as local law enforcement officers. So a Border Patrol agent may be driving a patrol road along the border and get a call for a burglary 50 miles away, and he's the only law enforcement officer, or she's the only law enforcement officer available. So what do? If there's a prowler at a house, they have to go take care of that so that no one is hurt or killed, which means they're not watching the border.
Well, let me tell you what's happening now. Because the agents, and you're absolutely right, what you said, you're 100% correct, most of them are deputized sheriff's deputies. The opposite is happening now. Now, because the border agents are not at the border Patrol agents, the sheriff's deputy are responding to the border, responding to the illegal smuggling and car chase and DPS troopers, and it's pulling them from their duties to respond to the family violence call, the burglary call, and car accidents and everything that police work. They're not there. So the community suffers. So yes, that's the ripple effect that people see all the time. And by the way, I've gone to these sheriffs and speak to a lot of them. They have 6 deputies, 2 deputies in some of these rural areas.
And they're covering 400 or 500 square miles.
Huge areas in Texas that it's very rural out there, sometimes very little radio communication. And so you're absolutely right. It's a ripple effect. When Texas brought the troopers down to help and they're still doing it down at the border. Well, we saw DUIs go up. We saw crashes go up because of speeding, because the DPS troopers were a supplement to the sheriff's deputies and local small police departments, and they suffered. I talked to the chiefs of police and the sheriffs, and like, man, we miss our troopers out here because they were our backup. I-20, I-35, these huge corridors. They were taking down, money. Drugs goes north, money comes south, bulk cash money, all that went down the drain. No one is responding to it.
And I think unless you've lived in a rural county, you don't realize that, it's rural and the population is spaced out, but things happen. There's crime, there's EMS calls.
That's right.
When I was working for ICE, I also volunteered as advanced life support EMT on the local rescue squad. And we were in upstate New York. We had a 65 square mile area, which is about a tenth of what most of those areas along the border are that, one department or one police department would cover. And I would work a 12-hour shift on a holiday weekend and do, crazy numbers of calls back to back and not sleep at all for the entire 12-hour shift. And that's in 65 miles that was, it was rural, it was farm country, but it was only an hour and a half from New York City. So we could, get a medical helicopter from New York City if we needed one. When you're along the border, if people haven't seen this, you're in places where sometimes you can literally drive 200 or 300 miles where you don't see civilization other than a truck stop or a gas station.
Very true.
And you may not run up against any other people while you're there. You're more likely to see wildlife than you are another person.
Very, very true. And that's life on the border. The ranchers have been affected. And I think people don't realize, like, one of the things they might hear a lot, their fences get cut. And people are like, the fence, just fix it. Listen, that in itself is the livelihood of the rancher and their cattle and whatever they have on their property. A cut fence for them costs lots of money. And then the liability that they sometimes experience because their cattle or their livestock got out, hit the highway, you hit the animal, and all these surrounding issues, and then the stories that I hear besides the dead bodies. I'll tell you one really quick. When a rancher's driving on his ranch on the road, sees a body on the road, he thinks, here we go, we have a dead migrant. Gets off. The migrant is not dead. He's pretending to be. Is wearing brass knuckles, and starts hitting them. The good thing, the rancher got off with his rifle. And then 4 or 5 other illegal aliens come out of the brush, steal his truck. He shoots at his own truck to disable them, and they get off and run off into the brush. That's what's happening in Texas at the person's property. And then another one in Alpine, Texas, a lady tells me that she found an illegal alien sleeping in her bed. I mean, this is sometimes you'll chuckle at these cases and you laugh, but this is the reality and the invasion of their privacy, of their security. They're afraid. They don't let their kids, the ones that have small children, play like they used to play. Some of these ranchers have 15, 16,000 acres. And like you said, shouldn't be anybody out here. But there are people from 150 different countries coming through there, sometimes wearing camouflage, sometimes bringing in drugs, sometimes just the smuggling, sometimes the cartel, whatever. They have cartel members, armed cartel members, patrolling in their ranches.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. And the people that say, it's a victimless crime.
No.
I mean, I personally don't think that people who are willing to hit a rancher with brass knuckles or go to sleep in some stranger's bed in a house are coming to the U.S. with the best interest of the country and a desire to work at heart.
No, that's true.
So, listen, Victor, it's been a pleasure. Victor and I are both headed later on this evening to go see a documentary that Tom Homan participated in called Death County and the River of No Return. So we need to go get ready for that. But it has been an honor and a pleasure to have you here. As I said before, Victor is a true American hero.
Thank you.
And also just a fun guy to hang around and shoot the breeze with. So it's been a pleasure to have you here. I think our viewers will learn a lot from what you've had to say. And please come back and join us anytime you'd like.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is Matt O'Brien for Early's No Border, No Country podcast. Thank you for watching. Please stab that like button and subscribe to our channel. If you'd like to learn more about Early and support our mission, you can go to www.early.org/podcast. In addition, this podcast appears on a number of other platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Thanks again for watching. This is Matt O'Brien for No Border, No Country.